Good afternoon, ma. Welcome again.
Thank you.
Um, I think I would like to start with who exactly is Oby Ezekwesili. There's a lot that many Nigerian youths know about you already, but telling your personal story from your childhood days to the lessons or values you got from your father,
Right,
how has that really shaped the kind of person that you become today?
right. So I am very public with how old I am. So people know that I was born in 1963, April 28, 1963. So I always say that I am one of those Republican children who were born by the time Nigeria became a republic, when we had to stop saying God save the Queen. So that also reflects in my very Republican attitude. Um, the, I was born in Lagos, and then we were moved because of my father's transfer to Port Harcourt when I was, I think, less than 3. And then we didn't even spend time there before the war broke out. And so we had to find a way back to the village in Newi South, local government of Anambra State, in Okpo specifically. And so by the time of the war, I was this little tot who was growing up, but I grew up overnight because I had a younger sister who became very ill in the course of the war. And with the war, you had to figure a way to keep body and soul together. So my mom did a lot of that. And so I had to grow up to be the mom of my sister. And so I would be the one that would put her on my back to go to the Catholic church up the hills to go get her ration. Because if you had kwashiorkor at that time, then you would be given cornmeal, special ration of it, and I used to have to fight for it. So I became I became known as that little girl you didn't cross her path when the ration for her sister was going to come to them. I loved my sister dearly. I still have memories of what happened to me with the fire burn while I carried her sitting by the fire. It's a map that I will forever carry, because my nylon dress caught fire while both of us slept off around the fireplace.
How young were you then?
The war was 1966. 1967. The coup was 66, war was 67, so it would be anything between 67 and 68. So, but I was a very mature child. My mom tells me some of the stories, and it surprises even me that, wow, was I saying all of that? So they said they used to call me old woman. I spoke and they would say, who just talked? So it was quite interesting, not just for my sister too. We had, because the war didn't get to, as in the physical, state of combat. It didn't happen within Newi. So we were spared that. So we were the ones that received many refugees. So this internally displaced people situation. So there were many children from those fleeing families that lived in my father's compound, in my grandfather's compound. And so I became like I grew up over time to be like the leader of the gang. And because I would, gather them and be trying to teach people. So my dad decided he was going to start homeschooling for the children in the compound. So we ended up not really missing that much in terms of the knowledge we needed for that stage of our growing up. And but as you know, thank God, the war came to an end by 1970, and that by that 1970, my dad had been posted back to return to Nigeria. He was posted back to the Lagos office of the Nigerian Ports Authority, which was where he worked. And so we returned to Lagos, and I started off my schooling. And my schooling days were very interesting. I found that I had so grown that in the class, I think I was way ahead in processing the issues of life skills. You know, when we talk about education, it's not just about what you're taught cognitively. It's also life skills. It's about your social interaction. I'd interacted with so many of these young, fellow children who were in one form of distress or the other. So, it was very obvious that I did not reason like a primary school child, So sometimes my teachers wondered what to do with me, So over time, graduated, went to university, and then finished university, went for my youth service. I did my youth service. I said it was a very interesting story. You have to hear this story. So in those days, we also had religious and sectarian crisis. It used to be known as Maitatsine in those days. And Maitatsine, this were it was an Islamic sect that would unleash violence in the north. So those breakouts of violence began to make families uncomfortable about their children going for their youth service in the north. So obviously for my mom, as it got closer to my graduation, and immediately you graduate. Not today that people have to wait for so long to be called up. You got automatic call up. And so my mom was worried about, gosh, what if they send her to the north? So I think that my mom, who is like a prayer, she prays. I mean, my mom lives on prayer, So I think she prayed so hard for me to be posted to a place that she was comfortable with. Because saying to my dad her concerns, her worries, my dad said, wherever they send her to, that's where she's going. I'm not talking to anybody. My dad was a man of incredible integrity. So he said, just brace yourself up for it. She'll be fine. But I think that my mom must have knocked on God's door so often that it was very strange. My posting came out and I was sent to my mother's state, Imo State. Not only was I sent to her state, I was sent to her. It was unbelievable. I thought to myself, oh my God, this is just so weird, But that's how I served in Owerri in Imo State. And then finished my service. My daddy wanted me to be a chartered accountant. So the first thing that we did was that I had to finish a master's before becoming a chartered accountant. And I did that by going to Unilag. And then finished my master's and then applied. That was the only time that I ever applied for a job, by the way. I applied to Deloitte and Touche Akintola Williams, and that's where I trained and qualified as a chartered accountant, and then began my journey of life.
With all of that, at what point did you decide to say you actually want to fight for a cause? If you want to...
It's interesting that you asked that question because, I normally say to people how at the age of 10, I woke up one morning and I said to my dad and my mom, sit down, I want to have a meeting. and my mom rolled her eyes like most mothers would do. And my father said, yeah, sure, let's have the meeting. So my mom said, what is this your meeting about? And I said, I'm 10 years old today. They said, but we know. We've all said happy birthday. We're going to celebrate your birthday. I said, well, this morning is to announce to both of you that I am now an adult and that nobody should talk to me anyhow in this house again. And that I will be responsible. I'll do everything that I'm supposed to do, but no shouting at me. My dad thought it was a good deal. My mom said if I pick my skull, you would know how not to tell me that you're an adult. But it was a fair deal because I took on from that moment. I became so responsible. We had people who lived with us. We never called them, any name other than our relations. And so I sort of became the grown-up one. I would do so many things, take care of the home, make sure that my siblings, I had 3 siblings, it was just amazing because my mom still tells the story of how at 10 I began to act like I was in my, in my yes, you know. So, but in those years of my, of my preteen, I would always say to my dad, why is it that our country does not look like the countries I see on television? I was puzzled by it. I saw a lot of poverty around me, misery, you know, and I would say, why? Why don't we look like these other countries? And my dad would use words like, it is because their leaders don't govern them well. So I would have those kinds of conversations of, what does it take to govern well? Why should we have so many people like us, you know, poor? You know, we shouldn't be poor. So why wouldn't they govern well? And then I would make a promise to my dad that when I grow up, I'm going to make sure we have good governance. So it became a pattern of talk. By the way, my dad made me read The Economist, you know, that magazine. And I would read all the newspapers. Oh, in those days, it was Daily Times, Sketch, Tribune, and the Concord was a later thing. It was a later offering, you know. At the time that I was younger, I'm trying to remember the one from the Post from the East, you know. So so it was quite fascinating how I would read these papers, and my dad and I, weekend would be used for having a conversation around the things that I have read over the course of a week. I was really that amazing daddy's girl. I mean, you couldn't separate me from my father. You just couldn't separate me from my father. He validated me so much, you know, growing up. So it became very clear that I had a mind for issues that have to do with policy, that have to do with how nations are built. And so it wasn't surprising that as I grew through life, no matter my area of specialization academically, I was into those issues. And so at the university, I was always the one who had an opinion about governance, you know. And then by the time I was a young professional, I was already known for my public conversation around issues of governance. And so it wasn't surprising that I became one of the co-founders of Transparency International globally. I was in fact one of the 3 youngest of us. The rest of them were, you know, like our father's generation, who had former presidents or current vice presidents and ministers from around the world. And, you know, and they were, for us, the co-founders who were something between 20 and 22, you know, in those early days. And I was one of them. So that helped considerably to shape and prepare my direction. The quest for good governance was always something that was in my blood. And for me to have said to my dad, when I grew up, I would do something about it, and to then end up becoming one of those that started the conversation globally on how to fix the problems of corruption, which is really the foremost symptom of bad governance, was an indication that I was probably a little child who was already seeing somehow ahead.
We take us right into the thick of things. You just mentioned corruption and, you know, your quest to become president of the country. How do you intend to solve this? It's like a recurring issue. How do you intend to solve this?
So it's a recurring issue, but what we know through history is that it can be solved. It's that it can be tackled. I always give the example, but those are not the only 2 examples. I always give the example of a place like Hong Kong, which is now part of China. You know, Hong Kong used to be so endemically corrupt. It was the kind of systemic corruption they had was bad. And then a place like Queensland, Australia was similarly very bad. In fact, they used to refer to Queensland, Australia as a third world country. as a pejorative way of saying they weren't like the rest of Australia, So, but, it got to the point where the people knew they had to fix this. And the leaders knew that the people wanted them to fix it. And from the lessons that we got from the things they had to do, you have to have a very strong political commitment to fix it. And that political commitment has to come from the highest, the topmost political leader. So either a prime minister or a president, as the case may be. And they have to live by example. Because it's a moral, you're basically saying to a people who have been sucked into systemic corruption and a state of acceptance of it as the way that things are done around here. You're going countercultural and saying to them, we need to stop this, we need to end this. And so for you to have the moral pedestal to drive it and for them to take you serious, you must be exemplary in the way that you are organizing the society's readiness to confront the challenge. So that's the underpinning thing. But the two pillars on which a comprehensive approach to fighting corruption rest: preventing the occurrence of corruption and sanctioning, punishing that bad behavior whenever it happens, regardless of who is involved. So preventing the occurrence, we know through research that when opportunities for corruption are huge, corruption happens frequently, it's proliferate. But when opportunities for corruption are limited, you have less corruption. We know that as a matter of research. So to prevent corruption is to take measures that reduce opportunities for corruption. So you do things like structural changes in the economy. Country when telecommunications sector was run by government, and it was a single monopoly called NITEL. That kind of situation presented opportunity for endemic corruption in the telecom sector. By simply deregulating, liberalizing the sector and privatizing the sector, you brought the private sector, brought competition, brought efficiency, and it changed. So nobody is thinking of how they're going to steal budget for NITEL, because NITEL is not in your budget anymore. And the sector has taken off faster than what would have happened if you continue to maintain a state monopoly. So when you look at other sectors in your economy that lend themselves to market efficiency and you're still holding them back, you will have plenty of opportunity for corruption. So when you see what goes on in the petroleum sector, or what still goes on slightly in the energy sector, or so you would know that these are the challenges of not structurally changing your economy so that government would stay within the activities that government do best. What are the activities that government do best? Government are good for policy. Government are good for building the processes and the institutions. Government are good for investing in areas of public good that private sector cannot necessarily find an incentive to do. So when you have an economic philosophy that lends itself to market principles, you reduce opportunities for corruption. When you do reforms of your public procurement system, for example, my first work in government was the due process, which fixed the public procurement system, and I worked on what is the law, the Bureau for Public Procurement. Or when you do something like introducing transparency to the oil and gas sector through the NEITI, Nigeria Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, you're bringing light into what happens in secret by doing a transparency initiative of that kind. What you then have, that we've always said, is that the antidote to bad behavior is light. If two people are locked away in a room and can discuss anything they want to discuss, and there are no parties that are aware of what, you could have a bad behavior that goes on. But if there is transparency, and no matter what it is, for as long as it has to do with public interest, everybody knows what's going on, then the proclivity for bad behavior is reduced. So reform your budget process, reform your public procurement process, reform your tax system, bring the effectiveness of the audit system in your public governance space. Because when people know that the office of the Auditor General is powerful and will scrutinize the things that have been done, there would be a tendency not to do things that will be detected through an audit process. You have to build those processes, those procedures, keep everything as simple as possible. Don't complicate things. There's something we call asymmetry of information, where some people have privileged access to information and others don't. It creates distortions and opportunity for corruption. So you have to deal with all of those things in order to prevent the occurrence. But some people, no matter how much you prevented, would still find opportunity for corruption. When they find such opportunity, then that second pillar of sanction, predictable sanction through law and its enforcement, having the right policing system and detection and investigation and prosecution, and the judiciary that is not corrupted to pervert the justice that needs to follow. So this is the way you have a comprehensive approach. And then it works. It worked in these two places I talked about, because today they are not usually mentioned in that neighborhood where we always come out as Nigeria when the Transparency International does its global annual ranking.
So this very well means that you are very open to a public debate with other candidates. I think INEC says you can start publicly campaigning in a few weeks' time. So you wouldn't mind it standing next to your other candidates for a public debate. I'm sure.
One of the top points of your campaign is to eradicate poverty in Nigeria. How exactly, ma'am, do you plan to do this?
So what we know of poverty is that poverty exists in economies that don't grow. What do we mean by economies growing? Economies grow when we look at how the scale of goods and services produced in that economy keep increasing over time. So if our GDP used to be $200 billion and the next year it grows by, say, let's just imagine that we began to grow at 10%, double digit for at least baseline double digit, and it grows by 10%. So 10% GDP growth in the next year is going to mean that by the next time you're talking about our GDP, you're saying it's 220 billion. Isn't that so? Now, the additional 20 billion would have been on the basis of productive activities. Now, for you to do productive activities, you're going to need the factors of production, isn't it? So because of that process, you would find that people who are in your economy would have opportunities to supply, services, their skills, or even their own ideas, their own, products to as part of the economic growth, right? So what happens that we know about economic growth and poverty reduction is that you need economic growth in order for people to have opportunities for jobs. The fastest way to take a person out of poverty is to give the person an income. Without an income, you can't tackle poverty. So what it means is that the more that we can create the environment that enables the economy to expand, the more the opportunities exist for people to have income. The more that people have income, the less that people are poor. So you take some who don't even have income at all yet, and you give them opportunities for income. Then by doing even more, you take those who have opportunity for income that is not living wage. You move them from a level of production, productivity, to a new level of productivity. They have additional income. So they move out of borderline poverty. So we know that this is the way that poverty reduces. So what happens is that some economies can grow without poverty reduction. Do you know why? If the growth is coming from sectors that don't engage people, capital intensive sectors, enclave sectors, say oil and gas sector, it's massive, but the number of people it can engage, very limited. So you know that growth can happen, but it will not touch poverty. So what you then do is that you begin to think of broad-based growth. You begin to think of inclusive growth, shared growth. Those are the kinds of ways that we define those kinds of growth, which means that you're going to look at certain sectors where majority of your people are operating, and they are operating at a low productivity scale. And you will then say, what are the barriers that stand in the way of these people having higher productivity? And you will begin to remove those barriers. Some of the barriers are often barriers of access to critical infrastructure, access to skills, the kind of skills that would enable you solve problems better and faster. The onerous situation of, just the processes. Some of the businesses have difficulties doing anything because all kinds of government rules and regulations stand in their way. You remove all those things. So essentially, to do poverty reduction in this economy, we must become a government that respects and cherishes private sector. And not just private sector at the large scale, but private sector even at the small scale. We want to remove, take a typical sector like agriculture. That is where majority, more than 60% of our rural dwellers are engaged in low productivity agriculture, subsistence farming agriculture. Now that kind of engagement is not economically sufficient to tackle poverty. So you have to do everything to move them out of low productivity to higher productivity. As you do that, you begin to shift people out of poverty. A country like China did that. China was able to grow double digit over almost for 2 decades. It was double digit growth. As it kept growing, it kept pulling out people from poverty. Today, some less than 40 years after China started its market reforms in their country, they have lifted more than 700 million Chinese out of poverty. 700 million Chinese, the equivalent of almost 3.5 times our population. So when we say that we can lift 80 million people out of poverty, that's even, lower than what this country has been able to achieve. And because we have even more opportunities than they had, we can do it. And for me, the approach is to look at human development. The human development as a priority is going to lead us on the path where we can tackle the poverty.
Security issues, like you mentioned about the rural dwellers who thrive on subsistence farming. Part of the challenges have been that men encroachment into their farmlands, and the security issues generally in Nigeria, it's a thing of worry. How do you intend to tackle that? Because that's in itself is like Nigeria itself. Nigeria is sitting on a kettle of bone. So yeah, so we would really like to know how you intend to tackle that.
So there are dimensions in security. There's military security where we're not doing well at all. But then there is also the domestic policing, internal security, where your police system is supposed to be effective. And then there is, of course, the issue of broader definition of security, and that then becomes human security, where it is both economic livelihood that guarantees people in a society that stake in society that they are unwilling to unleash violence or conflict in their society. So my own approach is going to be broadening the definition of security so that in those rural enclaves that almost always feel like they're not connected to urban Nigeria, they need to know that the president is aware of the challenges they face and that economic opportunities are also there. So when economic opportunities are there and young people have jobs and more jobs, they are productively engaged, you will have less number of them that fall through the cracks and are available as an army of foot soldiers for the enemy. Then militaristic and police security, you have to reform our establishments that are responsible for this now. Reforming them means that you have to design a security sector reform package. There have been many countries, especially countries that have gone through conflicts. We haven't gone, except for the Civil War. Lately, we haven't been through conflict, but we have been through something that resembles conflict. So we're like a post-conflict environment where we have stretched the police, stretched the military to the optimal that it can. So its resilience is now shaky. We need to reform. We need to reform, reprofessionalize. We need to make performance and accountability core ingredients or criteria for their performance. And then we need to also use that concept of prevention is better than cure. So the prevention side of it is that our intelligence gathering system has to be upgraded. It has to be cutting-edge technology. And we need to have an integrated approach where intelligence gathering enables us not just in terms of internal security, but because regional challenges abound. Today's terrorism act is not limited to physical activities within your own border. The truth is that we call things like terrorism global public bad. You have to worry about what's going on around your neighborhood. So regional and sub-regional as well as continental initiatives that enable us, and global, that enable us have access to the kind of intelligence that makes us preemptive, proactive, and preventive would be critical for me. And I think that the final part of that security question is that we all have to think of the structure of governance of security. Our current constitutional provision on security centralizes it. So the commander-in-chief would have to give a command to every system of security in the country. And that means that you can't do the surveillance and the security measures that need to happen at the local level quickly without getting instructions from Abuja. We have to discuss the structure of our centralized policing, centralized enforcement on security matters.